It's looking at the work of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and their movement into business. Now, what I love about WEAll Talks is it's an opportunity for us to amplify the work of our members, but also to provide an interactive space for members to really get below the bonnet of the work of the featured member. And as I mentioned, that featured member today is Erinch Sahan from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab deal. Now, really pleased to be asked to introduce Erinch because he was a co-collaborator on WEAll's very own Business of Wellbeing guide, which I think Tobele will put the link into the chat in a minute. And that came out in 2020. But also I'm really thrilled because I've had a chance to review the work that Erinch is going to be sharing with you today. And what I like so much about it is that it really challenges the whole business architecture, from the individual micro level firm to the industry, to the financing of business and the wider architecture that supports it. So it's really work that's perfectly aligned with the vision of a well-being economy. And I think it's work that can really go out and make a difference in the business space. Now, just a little bit to embarrass Erinch, his bio, which we always do for WEAll Talk, so you don't get out of it, Erinch, just because you're a friend. Erinch is the business and enterprise lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. He was recently the chief exec of the World Fair Trade Organization and previously spent 7 years at Oxfam leading campaigns initiatives and founded Oxfam's Future of Business initiative. He also worked at Procter & Gamble, but we're not going to hold that against him. We're going to say well done for using that insider knowledge as a market strategy manager to take the work that you've developed on behalf of Deal in the direction that you have. Erinch is also a board member of the Social Enterprise World Forum and teaches sustainable value chains at Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. If you believe one person can do all of those things, you won't believe that he's actually coming to us from holiday at the moment, although you won't know that from his backdrop, helpfully, otherwise we'd all be very jealous. I won't tell you where he is. Now, I don't want to hold the space anymore, so I'm going to pass on to Erinch in a second, just to say that Erinch is going to take about 20 to 30 minutes or so, which will then leave us about the same time, about 20, 25 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. You can either drop your questions into the chat during Erinch's presentation, and we'll look to those questions listed later after the presentation, or you can use the raised hand function and we'll go through in order to answer questions that Erinch's presentation may provoke. So without further ado, I will pass it across to Erinch. Erinch, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, Tobele, friends at Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, even though I've been on holidays and I've been able to take a little bit of a break. This was the great thing I've been looking forward to come back to and to talk to this community of change makers and transformers, because I know that so many of us share the same ambition of transforming business and doing it in a way that is both ambitious and practical and realistic. And bringing all those together isn't always easy, but it's essential if we're going to drive the changes we need. So I'm going to throw out my slides, and it's a little bit of a combination of ideas and concepts that we've been building at Deal for a few years now. But what it does is it also gives you a flavor of what's coming in terms of a toolkit that we've designed and created over the last 12 months since I've been in the role. And the direction that this will be going in terms of the way that we will be working with businesses around the world and change makers around the world to try to drive this sort of change. So here it is, a bit of an intro first into doughnut economics and the perspective that this brings into the business world. So a reminder that our current century has been jam-packed with crises. We began with the financial meltdown in 2008, the effects and the arrangements from which we still haven't quite recovered. And we've seen increasing climate breakdowns, and we've seen the COVID lockdown, all of which is demonstrating to us that our economy, the way that we operate, the way that we engage with nature and our planet and our societies are becoming more fragile, and they require us to rethink the broader economic models that we've been working with. Now, in response to these meltdowns, breakdowns, and lockdowns, what we propose as a Doughnut Economics Action Lab is a compass for human prosperity. And as many of you will know, this brings together two perspectives. It brings together the planetary boundaries work that Earth system scientists have done in saying these are the 9 critical boundaries of our planet. These are non-negotiables. These are the things we must not overshoot. We must figure out a way to stay within these planetary boundaries. Yet, as my colleague, friend, and author and co-founder of Doughnut Economics Action Lab, Kate Rayworth, observed about 10 years ago now, that we cannot just simply shrink our economies down to a point where we are below planetary boundaries, but no longer meeting life's essentials. So we also have this social foundation that we need to make sure we satisfy. We need housing, we need to have income and livelihoods, and we need healthcare and water and food, all these things that our economy needs to provide and societies need to provide. And it's between these two concentric circles, the planetary boundary, which forms the ecological ceiling, and the social foundation, which forms a foundational floor, that we see a donut-shaped space, which is that safe and just space for humanity. So that's a bit of a quick intro to Doughnut economics for anybody who needed that. And how are we doing? Well, not very well. We are in significant overshoot on the 9 planetary boundaries as a whole. In fact, the picture looks worse than even this, because chemical pollution wasn't quantified until recently. We now have new data from scientists to demonstrate that that too is in overshoot. And for hundreds of millions of people around the planet, we're also falling short on providing life's essentials for people. So if you were a business and you were looking at this, you would probably be saying, wow, we are overspending our budget and we are under-delivering on our objectives. This is out of whack at a micro level, at a macro level. Something is broken here and we need to quickly change course. Now, when we look at this at a national level, we zoom in, we start to see a similar picture emerge, but a slightly more nuanced one. And that picture tells us that in developed economies, or those high income economies that have been considered developed for so long, what has happened is a huge overuse of Earth's natural resources in order to meet much of the people's essentials to life in those countries. And a lot of countries that have followed that development trajectory have gone into that same pattern of overusing natural resources and being an overshoot of planetary boundaries in order to make improvements on the social foundation and essentials of life. Yet in the global south, in countries that are considered to have lower income, the reverse is true, where they are not using their fair share of Earth's resources. They are not in overshoot, but they are in significant shortfall on life's essentials. This picture looks similar, no matter which country we flip into it, whether it's Spain or Australia, where I grew up, or many of the middle income countries. The pattern is similar. And what it tells us is that we are all developing countries now. We all need a new transformation away from our current trajectory. And that means that transition is needed to be ambitious. So what's causing all this? Well, we know that this degenerative model of taking from Earth, making stuff, using stuff, and losing stuff, and repeating this over and over again, and making this the foundation of our economic model, whereby if we slow this process down, we're considered to go into recession, we're considered to go into economic downturns, means that it's become an issue that is staring us in the face, yet is difficult to address for so many around the world. So this degenerative model is very much behind a lot of what we're seeing, as well as spiraling inequality and huge injustice in the way that value and opportunity is shared around the world. So what we are seeing, though, and this is where the hopeful side comes in, this is where the business world starts to come in, is that we're beginning to see examples and pioneers demonstrating that we don't need to be stuck in a degenerative model. We can move towards a regenerative model, a model that works with and within the cycles of the living world, a model that is, as the circular economy pioneers and thinkers would put it, is regenerating in terms of biological materials and restoring Earth's technical materials, so that we're creating those positive loops that are bringing in that circular economy. Now, examples are beginning to be fairly plentiful from across the business world, whether it is examples like Fairphone, which is demonstrating you can design a phone around principles of circular economy instead of the principles of built-in obsolescence, which is the mainstay of much of the technology industry, where you actually make more income, more sales, more revenue and profit by selling you a new phone or a new electronic device every 2 years that's going to break down. Fairphone has done the opposite, said, well, let's design something around the concept of circular economy rather than maximizing immediate short-term sales. Other examples like interface carpets that look to biomimicry and Mother Nature and the 3.8 billion years of evolution of biology in our biological world for inspiration. And to ask the question, what would be here if our factory wasn't here? There would be wildland. What would that wildland be doing? Well, it would be sequestering carbon. It would be cleaning the air. It would be cleaning the water. It would be providing nutrients into the soils for other life to thrive. That generosity that nature would otherwise be providing, can we replicate some of that? Not just get to zero emissions, but start to sequester carbon and replicate aspects of biomimicry. Other examples, like one that I worked on in some of my last months, actually, in the fair trade world, was to bring plastic recycling together with the principles of fair trade in partnership with the Body Shop and Plastics for Change, a social enterprise based out of Canada, working across the world, including in India, where they worked to make sure that waste pickers that were collecting the virgin plastic were also treated with the dignity that, say, fair trade can offer other aspects of the economy, like farmers in cocoa or coffee who are provided long-term commitments, who are provided prices that help them move towards a living income or living wage, and help them get to a point where there's more stability in producer organization, for instance. That sort of bringing together regenerative as well as distributive principles became an inspiration for me to see move forward. And then other examples like Houdini, based out of Sweden, a sportswear garment manufacturer and brand. But what's interesting about Houdini is not just the fact that they've designed circular products, which they have. They've designed products where the natural fibers and the technical nutrients or technical materials can be separated and go into different loops that create positive benefits. But they've made their technology and intellectual property open for their competitors to see, to use, to build on. And what Houdini have demonstrated is that actually this isn't an example of change where we one by one go and crack new innovations, but actually we need a collaboration. And for that collaboration to happen, it's not going to happen through one company increasing their market share over time through protecting their intellectual property, but it's going to happen through the openness of use of concepts of commons, for instance. So these are all examples that provide great inspiration on the regenerative side. However, let's look at the distributive side, so the social issues that also underpin doughnut economics. And that's about moving towards that distributive sharing opportunity and value with all who co-create it kind of philosophy and approach. And there are lots of examples of that also happening. One great one, El Puente, that I got to know very well when I was working in the fair trade world, based out of Germany, multi-million-dollar importer and distributor of both food products and garments and homewares into German shops across the country. What's interesting about El Puente that I witnessed firsthand was when the COVID pandemic hit, the fashion industry, by and large, started canceling contracts, started de-risking, brands started de-risking themselves, started renegotiating prices. So risks were pushed down to producers, to manufacturers, to groups of artisans and farmers that were least able to afford that risk and bear that risk and issue around it. Instead, El Puente provided great longer-term contracts. They provided greater commitments. And in fact, they paid upfront for orders that they didn't know when they would receive, because they knew that cash flow would be needed in places across South Asia and Latin America and Africa, where workshops and production facilities were closing down, ships and transport options were closing down, and shops were closing, and orders were being cancelled, and people didn't have a social safety net. So they realized actually the best thing they can do is keep these enterprises and producer organizations afloat. It was in stark contrast to the rest of the industry at large. And the reason they were able to do that is they're a multi-stakeholder governance business. So they have a board that has not just representatives of their own workers and employees, as well as communities of world shops across Germany and founders of the business, but they have a board that is that has representatives of their supply chain. So the very businesses, the producer cooperatives, the artisan organizations and enterprises across the world who supply into the business are co-owners and also co-govern the business. So their voice was there immediately, in stark contrast to most of their competitors. Other examples like Richer Sounds, which deployed employee ownership model and transitioned into that over time as its founder realized that, look, I'm going to retire, I don't have children, I'm not going to take this business to my grave, and the thing I would love to leave behind is a legacy of commitment and support to employees and communities. We can do that through changing our ownership model and making sure that we don't just have long-term commitments, but also share the upside of the business, share the profits of the business with the workers and employees that make it a success. Other examples like Airbnb, which reinvest half of their revenue back into local communities to make sure that the benefits of tourism are distributed in those communities, and they're not acting to just drive up values of housing to make it unaffordable for people to live there and to rent in some of these places, but to instead make sure that people can only enlist on that platform if they've got a maximum of 2 properties, for instance. So they're taking measures to also promote slow tourism, all these really interesting distributive practices that are in the very design of the business. And the last example is we want to bring ones from Tax and from Lush, a company that is also in contrast to most of the world's companies that want to minimize their tax bill and pay a lot of money for advisors to make sure that their tax bill is low as possible. And instead, companies like Lush are signing up for the fair tax mark to make sure that they're paying their fair share of contribution towards all of those health and education and policing and infrastructure that allows their business to thrive and to work. So all of these are very much inspiring, but very much exceptions. They're not the norm in their industry. We're not seeing retail overall move towards employee ownership. We're not seeing wholesale and distribution businesses incorporate suppliers into their decision-making, their governance, and their ownership model. We're not seeing tourism industry promote slow tourism or to share half the revenues back with communities. We're not seeing most companies try to pay a fair share of tax. These are exceptions, but they demonstrate that a different world of business is possible. So this is where we start to ask ourselves, how do we get these kinds of businesses? How do we get the transformations needed that will allow this to become the norm across these industries? Well, there's a few ways of approaching this, and we see a lot of approaches that include exerting a version of public pressure. That might include consumer pressure, it might include unions organizing, or it might include community organizations, might even include governments and regulation. All of this is very effective to push companies to do things that they were maybe otherwise not going to do, especially on higher profile issues. It might happen through enlightened leadership, as we see a huge, vast array of very effective approaches to try to promote inspired and enlightened C-suite leadership, and business owners try to look at a very long-term perspective of their business. It could include setting targets, it could include setting metrics, measuring impact more effectively. A lot of these approaches that are trying to calculate things more effectively and beyond just the finances of the business. And it could, of course, happen through all of those huge range of initiatives that are making the business case, saying, hey, look, you'll actually have a higher return in the medium to long term if you're able to retain your consumers, if you're able to have greater security of supply because of your commitments, if you're able to demonstrate to your workers how committed and authentic you are and you retain the talent pool for longer. All of these ways of having an advantage possibly through doing these things. And all of these are very valid, important, critical, effective approaches that we see. But the approach that doughnut economics is taking is none of these. It's taking a different approach that can reinforce and support all of these separate approaches that we see out there in the broad array of approaches that are being taken. And this is what we're proposing essentially. What we're seeing is that to move from degenerative and divisive towards regenerative and distributive economies, we need clearly a lot of action from governments, from the commons, from communities, from NGOs, and this bubble isn't proportionate to just how important that work is. But we need a lot of also impact and action from business. Now, the current design of business essentially is able to do regenerative and distributive actions if it can be demonstrated to maximize margins and dividends, or it's sort of pushed in that direction by certain enlightened leadership, or more effective accounting, or more pressure from government or public or workers. All of that is useful, and what we end up with is a slither of things that are happening in the mainstream business world that we all celebrate, we all applaud, and we're all enthusiastic about. And these are the things that are possible within the current design of business, and we want to push as much of the business world into that as possible. However, if we redesign business to enable it to pursue viable, thriving strategies that are regenerative and distributive at their core, then we start to unlock a whole host of ideas and actions that are the kinds of ones I just mentioned, because the kinds of ones I just mentioned are not the ones that pure enlightened leadership or pure pressure from consumers is able to pursue. They go beyond that. They are there because the business has embodied a particular design that goes beyond what it has to do and is doing as much as it can do within its own context. So the way that we're looking at this is we're asking businesses, and we'll be coming up with a tool over the next, we're launching on the 7th of November that I'll mention at the end of this talk briefly as well. And as part of that tool, what we're asking people to do is to visualize a thriving future economy and really visualize this that in a way where it's regenerative and distributed by design. And your business, whether you're a startup entrepreneur, whether you're an investor in an early stage business, or you're a CEO, or you're somebody that can affect a company one way or another in its future decision making, well, that business you need to envision as being part of that regenerative and distributive economy. And then we ask them, well, what has your business started doing in order to become that? Whether it's 2030, 2040, 2050, what does your industry look like, and how do you belong in an industry that is regenerative and distributive? And what has it now stopped doing critically? Because a lot of the products and services we see are going to need to be replaced and stopped and need to evolve significantly. And then we ask, well, if we explore those sorts of ideas, can we do it from the perspective of, say, activists and campaigners? What would they tell you are the most ambitious ideas you can pursue? Or progressive industry leaders, or a diverse group of colleagues from across that business? And then we also say, well, think of the voices that are not in the room, because very few businesses have multi-stakeholder governance at their board level. Very few businesses have an ability to draw in voices from the supply chain, voices from communities, critically voices from across our ecological landscape. And we ask them to envision what would local communities ask? What would a nearby forest and river say for you to pursue? Whether it's changing production, changing manufacturing models, changing certain practices. What would workers in a supply chain say? What would air and soil and employees say? And we ask, what about the living planet? And what about customers? What about future generations? What would grandkids and great-grandkids say to you as a business leader? What would your investors and commercial partners down the track in that future economy say? And what we start to see is ambitious ideas come out of these questions. Ideas that get blocked, that get weeded out, that get selected away from the company because of the design of the business. Ideas that maybe challenge concepts of margins, concepts of capital expenditure and internal investment. The kind of ideas that maybe the scientists in the R&D team are coming up with, but it's being pushed down because of financial parameters. The kinds of ideas that maybe product designers would love to pursue, but it's not going to quite meet the margin requirements, or it's going to require an investment that doesn't quite have the payback period that internal capital expenditure requirements would necessarily put. So you start to get these ideas that get on the table, that bubble underneath the business. And through this, what you can do then is to ask, well, how is the design of your business currently holding you back from pursuing ideas like this? And how may the design of your business enable these sorts of ideas? How might you design your business differently, evolve that design of your business in order to pursue those ideas? And at that point, you start to unlock a new model of thinking, because you end up with an ambition that's based on what the company needs to become rather than what the company is today. And suddenly redesigning aspects of business become viable. So based on that and this framework that we use then to take businesses through this of purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance, and it's come from the work of Marjorie Kelly, the wonderful analyst, author, researcher, thought leader on enterprise design, who wrote the book Owning Our Future 10 years ago. We borrowed from Marjorie, from her work, and we built on it to figure out what it means to take doughnut economics into a company. And essentially is a quick run through of what this framework asks. So firstly, purpose. It asks questions like, what is the core purpose? So why does the company exist? Does it exist to produce products as cheaply as possible, as much as possible, sell as much as possible, and minimize costs to the extent possible, like fast fashion, for instance? Or is it there making decisions, prioritizing other factors, and not putting a straitjacket on itself based on a particular business model? Like Manosta Uruguay, a business that is multi-million-dollar, again, business based out of Uruguay, but owned by 12 women's producer cooperatives spread across the country, who are making high-end fashion products that are sold on Champs-Élysées and Madison Avenue and able to meet the highest requirements of high-end fashion, but every decision is made to benefit those women and produce with natural fibers to benefit local ecology. And then we look at networks and we ask questions such as, well, is the business structured in its relationships with government, with supply chains, with commercial partners around topics like, trying to avoid tax or modify every aspect of relationships? And is it part of networks and communities of businesses that are holding back progressive change, like some of the ones I've listed here? Those regressive lobby groups that have, for instance, fought against action on climate by governments. Or on the other hand, is it part of that regenerative and distributive idea of, making sure it has long-term committed partnerships across supply chains, commercial partnerships, in all of its relationships, and is a part of communities that are driving positive, ambitious change, like circular economy or renewable energy, collaborative projects and alliances? Then we get to the meat of things. So governance is absolutely pivotal. And of course, governance is about decision-making. And it asks, is the governance of this business essentially in service of financial benefits for shareholders? Or is it in service of social and ecological benefits for stakeholders? And here's where things get a little bit uncomfortable, because then we start talking about power and voice. We start talking about priorities and trade-offs and how they navigated. So is it navigated in a very typical venture capital structure, which is trying to grow the business as quick as possible, usually at any cost, and usually in order to enable the fastest exit for investors? This is a very common methodology for supporting startups and new stage businesses, is to just bring in a standard plain vanilla venture capital fund structure with a particular governance model, which means the board is controlled by the investors who've come in with a very particular perspective on the future of the business. And there are examples of these alternatives that very few founders and startups are able to consider, and we want to really see these considered much more broadly, like the River Simple model of custodianship, where every board member has a different responsibility and is a custodian to a different stakeholder group, different perspective, including the planet, including communities and workers, and including, of course, commercial partners and investors. And other examples like Faith in Nature, that just a few weeks ago decided to put nature on its boards by appointing Lawyers for Nature, an organization that represents the interests of nature and takes court cases on behalf of our planet, giving them a board seat. So they have a vote and they're privy to all the information and decision-making on the board of Faith in Nature. This is a different way of designing the governance of a business. It's not just wordsmithing something, but saying actually within the very machinery of the governance structure, we're going to start to put in these ideas that go beyond just having the right terminology in a purpose statement. Then we go into ownership. So this is, of course, a lot of these are hugely overlapping with each other, but it's a helpful way to channel people's attention into different aspects of a business. And there are many ways a business can be owned. Not saying anything is particularly good in and of itself or particularly bad, but there are ways that we can break some of the regular mainstream ways of ownership models, including employee ownership, which has been on the rise in many countries, particularly as founders retire and all those businesses founded in the baby boomer period are beginning to see people get into retirement. But also Patagonia gave us an amazing example just again a few weeks ago of saying, well, actually we can structure ownership in a very creative way. Let's create two share classes. Share class A is where all of the dividend rights will sit. So all of the profits, whatever's left over after the company is operated, will go to those shareholders, and that will be controlled by an ecological NGO. And part B, so a different share class of shares, they won't get any dividends, but they will get all of the voting rights. So they will be able to make sure the company is looking after its purpose, and that's controlled by a purpose foundation, a foundation that doesn't have any other economic interest in the business, doesn't have a financial stake, but has got the control and the power to make sure that the business stays on course with its mission. So it separated power and money in its ownership model to make sure that those who have an incentive to have high returns, in this case, an ecological NGO that gets the profits, doesn't necessarily force onto the business the perspective of maximizing returns and maximizing dividends through every decision. And those that control the business's purpose are actually not burdened with their own financial interests over it. So can look at it through a pure perspective. I mean, this is one model. It's called steward ownership, by the way, and there are dozens of companies around the world, hundreds, that have embodied this model, from Einhorn to ShareTribe to Ecosia and beyond. But it's a way of thinking about ownership as a way to design a company, to build in and bake in a purpose. Then we start looking at finance, and we look at the relationship with finance, whether it's, and it's not just about the ownership model, but also, is that model asking for quarter is king? Is it trying to grow sales, grow profits, grow market share as fast as possible, as large as possible? Or is it serving purpose? Is it trying to expand benefits and provide flexible margins and reinvest for impact? An example is Dr. Bronner's here, which is a company based in California that I've got to know quite well over the last few years as well. But what's interesting is that they reinvest, or they donate a large chunk of their profits. So their internal decision makers know that actually there isn't a pressure on them to increase returns, because they can pursue a regenerative project. They can pursue an organic agriculture project, for instance, even if it costs more, because if they increase their margin by foregoing that project, then the money would go to an ecological NGO anyway. So they've been able to liberate decision makers to take more ambitious steps in this direction. And here, words like margins and reinvestment, these are words that have been missing from so much of the sustainability narrative and debate. We've almost didn't talk about money. And of course, money is often what is enabling or holding back those actions that we all try to get within the business world. Or does a business persistently and stubbornly insist on a particular high net margin requirement, holding back regenerative ideas and designs? Or does it allow for flexibility? Does it allow for reinvestment? Or does it say that, look, we need to have a particular financial parameter here that will determine what kind of ideas and actions and strategies will get investment in the business? So we can design these things accordingly to what the business wants to and needs to pursue. Essentially, all of this is a way of saying that it's an invitation for us all to design businesses for the purpose that they need to serve. And we've probably gone through a stage where the last 5 or 6 years, we've done great purpose washing, fantastic greenwashing, and great sort of articulation of wonderful, lofty words from the corporate world without actually changing the design of the business itself. And instead, it's an invitation to go, okay, let's make this a reality. Let's design the organization around these words. So let's design so that the processes of the business are aligned with its purpose, like the product design processes of Fairphone, for instance. Let's design to lock in and protect the mission and the legacy of that business and prevent things like hostile takeovers over time, things that we've seen with so many impact-driven or socially minded brands that got taken over and over time have been watered down in terms of their impact. Let's design to enable those deep long-term partnerships that don't treat Earth and its supply chains as commodities, but as long-term partners, and maybe achieve greater supply chain security through that design, through co-ownership, co-governance, and commitments that are much more long-term, much more committed. And let's design to channel the investment that's needed, because we also need to make sure that if we're generating the kind of ideas that are going to help transform our world, then we also need to fund those ideas. And those funds are going to come from partly from outside investors, but also from internal investment. And let's be deliberate about this. Let's think about issues like, or options like, dividend caps to enable that internal reinvestment to happen, or flexible margins that enable that internal investment to happen. So all of these are design choices, and it's an invitation to design business around these. And the core question essentially is, how do we then move from this 20th century way of designing business that had as a central organizing principle, how much financial value can we extract from this enterprise, and instead move towards the 21st century model of designing business, which is how many benefits can we generate in the way we design this enterprise. We've created some options and some questions and activities across this tool that we'll be launching on the 7th of November that ask some probing questions around this. They go through a bit of a journey, but land on some, what I would call uncomfortable and sort of deep existential but critical questions, such as which stakeholders need to become part owners of a business, and how should voting rights be distributed, or how can reinvestment be enabled, and what is a fair return for investors, and how can they exit through the business while maintaining the purpose of that business, or critically questions like, how does the governance or the board, for instance, navigate trade-offs between ecological, social, and financial goals? Does it sweep them under the rug and say, oh, we've got a business where we figured out how we don't have any trade-offs and actually it's all win-win-win? Or are they honest when trade-offs occur and how that is navigated? And critically, of course, how should decision makers treat those big, bold, transformative ideas that bubble up from time to time within a business, but often get stamped down because of very rigid financial parameters that are designed around 20th century rather than 21st century business thinking? So all of these are challenging questions that I think when you approach them with an authenticity, you end up looking into the deep design of business. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek of where we're at with the tool that we'll be launching on the 7th of November. So what the tool will essentially do is take businesses and those that facilitate engagement with businesses through a journey. And this tool will be in the commons. So it'll be open for anybody to use who is in a business, and anybody to use who works with a business, as long as they meet particular criteria, which we'll be putting out onto as a part of the tool. But essentially it says, let's start by looking at the donut and figuring out where the current impacts of the business is. And then let's think about what are the biggest, boldest, regenerative and distributive ideas that that business will need to pursue across the board, across its business, and in the most ambitious way that maybe is currently not put on the table. Then we ask, what is the current, how does the current design of the business treat ideas like this? Does it hold them back? Does it enable them? And what can we see and learn from those insights of how those sorts of ideas are treated through the different aspects and design layers of business? And then lastly, we ask, when we invite businesses to think about ways they can evolve their business, think about ways they can evolve the design of their business. And we do this through giving some examples that could be, some more entry-level things any business can do. A business can, for instance, set up a fund that puts a proportion of profits into enabling those ideas that maybe don't quite meet the highest financial requirements, or can create a board seat that is maybe just to begin with an observer seat for community members or environmental groups or supply chain representatives, and then move towards more ambitious changes in their design. But all of this is to start to move the conversation towards, well, how can we make sure the design of the business can get out of the way of the most ambitious ideas that are beginning to bubble up through the business world? And the last bit of this, and it's another sneak peek of one of the aspects or components of the tool before we launch it, is to then ask, well, you've done a bit of a donut mapping, which is the top left that you can see, where the greens and the reds and the hazards sort of start to look at, well, which part of this donut am I impacting and being impacted by as a business? And then you've come up with big ideas that can really test the boundaries of what's possible. And you've come up with, then thirdly, you see on the left there, ways that the design of the business can evolve in some of the different layers of the business. And then start to tell the story of the future of that business. How is it going to evolve? How is it going to be part of that economy that is regenerative and distributive? So my final slide is this, and there's a small URL at the top, that doughnuteconomics.org/events/211. That is the event where we are launching this tool on November 7. We've got some amazing speakers, including Marjorie Kelly and Kate Rayworth, but we've got people from 200 Million Artisans in India. We've got Transform Finance's executive director, a whole host of people from impact hubs and startup incubators who have been helping us develop this tool. And we've done 21 pilot workshops around the world with different groups of businesses. And we've had now over 150 businesses take part in this in order for us to develop this methodology and tool. And the tool is going to have all of the guidance, all of the slides, all of the activities, all the examples and samples and guidance in order for anyone to run this workshop that is truly curious and ambitious enough to push into this conversation, lean into the conversation around the deep design of business. So I invite you to join us on the 7th of November. I think there are a few spaces still left, but it will be broadcast on YouTube as well. So yeah, that's it from me for now, Michael. I hopefully haven't got over my time there, but hopefully it was clear.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Erinch. The questions have been flying in to the chat while you've been chatting. Now, with 15 minutes or so left, there's no way that we can get through them all. I've been trying to sort of think where there's been similarities, and I've condensed a few. So while people are maybe popping their hands up if they want to ask you a question directly, I'm just going to feed you quickly some of the sort of summary type questions I've been seeing emerge. So first one, some views as how the work that you do in business in WEAll relates to ESG, so environment, social, governance metrics in the world of finance, and also that Kate was on the commission for Earth for All, and so any reflections on how this work connects into Earth for All. So how does it relate to ESG and Earth for All? Secondly, how do you deal with the fact that you have certain organizations, businesses, who are trying to internalize externalities, trying to pursue a circular economy approach, versus those who are, you know, take, make, break and don't care about externalities? How do you deal with this sort of unfair playing field? And then lastly, you know, lots of people on the call here are working directly with businesses and sometimes struggle to cut through to find where that incentive, that exciting point is beyond the profit motive for business owners to explore this type of change. So perhaps you could take those three firstly, and then we'll go from there.
Great. I'll do them very quickly, Michael, because I realize I've gone a bit over than I had originally intended, but I got a bit worked up by some of the content. So the ESG and Earth for All, I don't have a lot to say about, but ESG, I mean, I think the key thing that this adds to all of those approaches is to say, well, ESG measures some practices and some impacts. We've got lots of fantastic ways of setting targets, etc. But actually, all of those will require actions, and they will require significantly transformative ideas from the business. So in order to actually mobilize businesses and enable them and unlock them to take those actions and steps needed that all of these other approaches are asking businesses to do, we probably will need to also make changes in the designer business to ramp up its ambition, to unlock some of those processes that will allow it internally to pursue it. So I think that's the broader picture of how it relates to so many of these kinds of ideas and sort of issues and approaches. And in terms of like the exciting points for businesses that maybe might feel like they're at a disadvantage because they're internalizing things, as you say, that others are externalizing and imposing costs externally versus maybe foregoing some of those opportunities to externalize. I mean, some of the lessons and learnings from our pilot workshops has been, firstly, you end up with a more resilient business when you do this. You end up with a business that can withstand crises, that has got deeper relationships with its customers, with its supply chains, with its community, with its commercial partners, that is fit for purpose for the economy that has to arrive, that economy we have to create, that we have to transition towards, and is ahead of the game, is ahead of regulations that might be coming anyway and must come in some of these aspects, and is going to attract a level of authenticity because it's doing it it's not working out what's the minimum it has to do and get to it. It's going far beyond. It's not limiting itself with a target. It's actually saying, what is the maximum I can do in order to be regenerative and distributive? And I think all that comes through when we work through this with ambitious business leaders who see that, look, this is not just about, you know, a benevolent founder doing some good stuff at the helm of the business, but this is a way of baking into the business and excitingly designing the businesses of the 21st century, rather than just working with broken models from the 20th century that we plead with to do a little bit more, to push a little bit further. So that's a little bit of a coverage, I think, of your main summaries there, Michael.
Super. Okay, just before Michael Hallam, I go over to you, I'm just going to pop a couple more questions, again, trying to synthesize what's come through. But firstly, I was actually at the London parliamentary launch of Earth for All. And just for the person who asked that question, I think what's so interesting about it is it shows the interconnected nature of the crises of a lack of empowerment, inequality, as well as the environmental crises. And it shows that's in a systems model that you cannot achieve one without the other. And so, you know, I think that is how it talks to the donut, because it basically shows you cannot get within those planetary boundaries without creating or moving above those social foundations. Another quick one, I'd ask you to do some comparisons. There have been a couple of remarks as to what your views are on B Corps. Given we look to amplify and champion many pathways to the wellbeing economy vision, perhaps you could just give your reflections in terms of where B Corps could go further, rather than necessarily a criticism of where they are or what they're doing particularly.
And our friends from various B Labs around the world, by the way, have been a part of this journey for us. And we're doing pilots with them. We're working with them closely. My summary is essentially that B Labs and the B Lab assessment tool provides some really useful, practical things companies can do, allows you to gain points on some important, useful pioneering practices and ways of measuring impact and ways of taking steps. What it stops short of doing is fundamentally redesigning a business, fundamentally redesigning its own. You could get some points for doing some of these things, but by and large, it doesn't ask the kinds of questions that we're bringing up here. So we would see this as a complementary thing, that you would unlock a lot of those practices that are in, whether it's B Corp certification or even fair trade certifications or other models like, you know, economy for the common good, which does fantastic, phenomenal work. And there's arising new ideas as well, like post-growth entrepreneurship and steward ownership I mentioned, platform co-ops and employee ownership. A lot of them are part of trying to unlock new practices. And if we can redesign and open up that innovation in the deep design of business, what our premise is and our hypothesis is that we would supercharge all of those actions and activities and initiatives across the world.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erin. So while I dive back into the questions that were typed into the chat, Michael, over to you. If you can keep it brief, we only have so much time.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Erin, for a very inspiring presentation. About a couple of years ago, I was on in an event with Kate Rayworth, and she was saying that the donut model is a bit of a work in progress, really, and she was inviting people to effectively riff on it and evolve it and develop it. So I run a network where we're trying to apply donut economics to a local set of about 120 businesses in Lancaster in the UK. So we've done a bit of riffing. So I wondered what kind of relationship you have to people who hack the model and innovate the model. I'll put a link to the riff actually in the chat, but yeah, I'd just like your feedback on how open you are to people hacking your model.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have some guidance around it, because the biggest danger that we see, Michael, is that there are a lot of approaches in the business sustainability world that want to make things as easy as possible for a company to step in and start taking actions. And we want to make sure that the integrity and the ambition of this is retained. So we're quite specific about the steps required in terms of, if you're going to do donut economics with businesses, you have to look at deep design. That is the central question. That is the central pillar. If you're not changing deep design of business, it's not donut economics. It's something else, and that's great, but it's not donut economics. But in terms of the way we expect people to use this tool and this framework would be for them to take it into their realm and apply it in their own work. So whether it's a consultant that sees an opportunity to have these ambitious discussions, or a business network, or a net, or a certification model, or a investment community, they sort of start, we hope that they can take it and run with it and use it directly. But we do require people to use all of the steps as they are, because you start to adapt bits and pieces of it, and we can see how actually we could undermine the integrity and ambition of this. And we're not proposing to set up a way of verifying every individual application of it. So we just ask people to do that. And we're also creating a community on the platform to bring
that's great, thank you. I know time's short, but no, we've kind of hacked it in the sense that we've added a third dimension to it, a time dimension to it. So we've turned it into a donut cylinder. So we're at quite a fundamental level in the models of evolution. That's the point we've hacked, not so much in its specific applications. So
great. Well, do get in touch with us, Michael. we'd love to hear it. And Kate, conceptually, I'm sure we're interested.
Okay, I'll put a link in the chat, so you just have to fish it out. And I'd love to follow up with you on that.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so there were a couple of other questions how you can get involved, but it sounds very much like you said you're going to be building a community. There's the actual launch event of the tool on the 7th of November. So I guess those are the obvious starting points, Erinch, would that be correct? Wonderful.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
And on another point, some questions said, many of your slides, the left-hand slide is very much what business schools, unfortunately, continue to teach, the divisive, non-circular models. Are you reaching out to business schools, and is there a potential deal business toolkit learning module somewhere in the offing?
Yes, there is. In fact, we're having a little bit of a gathering online of some of the key collaborators. There's been business school. We've developed this with the Center for Economic Transformation in the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam. We've had so many others. We did something at LSE. We've worked with Bristol Uni, University of Passau has been involved, University of Pittsburgh. There's been various business schools from around the world that have been very engaged. CISL, where I teach, but also they've been a part of this as well at Cambridge, and Said Business School as well in Oxford. So we've had a lot of input from different business schools, and our goal is to also challenge them and say, how could your teaching start to train people that are coming out of business schools to redesign business, to not just try to do some good at some places, but to grow profit as much as possible, but to say, okay, well, how can we fundamentally transform the deep design of business? So we expect there'll be a lot of traction in that area, and we'll be supporting parts of that going forward.
Absolutely. There was another question too in the chat. It was about the dismay in many startups, some in the sort of high-tech space to undo the damage done in the agriculture. Big investment firms still look again at the left-hand side of your diagram. I'll give a shout out to Zebras Unite, who I think are doing some great work around creating new financial products to make finance more accessible. Do check them out. But again, any other reflections on other pathways to bringing in finance to what many mainstream people see as radical different types of business?
Yeah, we've got a separate project that we've been working with Transform Finance on in the US, and they're looking at investment design. So if entrepreneurs and businesses begin to design businesses in this way, how can the design of investment start to match these sorts of regenerative distributive designs? And then we also plan to kick off work on policy and going, what could policy do? Not just to regulate the existing designs of business more effectively, but to start to shift the deep design of business, to start to shift ownership models, start to shift governance models in a more deep and fundamental way. So investment is going to be a big part of the next 6 to 9 months of our work on this. And Zebras Unite, amazing work. If anyone hasn't checked it out, they did great work on exit to community, for instance, with MedLab and University of Colorado.
Smashing. Okay, well, we are coming up to the hour. There was always going to be more questions than we could deal with in the time that we have. But Erinch, thank you so much. I think if I have not done justice to anyone's questions that I've been looking at and trying to translate from the chat, Erinch, are you happy to put your email address into the chat and folks can catch up afterwards? Of course, as Erinch has already mentioned, there's the formal launch on the 7th of November, so you are more than welcome to that. Are you going to go into a bit more detail about the tool there, Erinch?
That's going to be completely about the tool. So yes, absolutely. And I'll put the link into that event as well in the chat, so people can sign up and hopefully join.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, personally and also from WEAll. And I'm going to give the final word over to my colleague, Tobele, who is just going to close the session off with what's next. Thanks, Tobele.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Erinch. We really appreciate you being with us, and to everybody that has joined us. We just loved having you today. We'd love you to keep updated with WEAll news. So if you would like to become a member, or if you'd like to just keep updated with other activities or any other questions that you may have, please feel free to pop me an email. I'm just putting it on the chat, my email address. And you can email me with any questions or any interest that you have. And then, yes, we will be recording, well, we have recorded the session. So it's going to be loaded onto our YouTube channel next week. So for those who wanted to rewatch it, or if you wanted to share with your other communities, please make sure you go to our WEAll YouTube channel, and I'll put that into the link. And I know so many people have been asking me for the chat. So I'm going to save the chat right now and resend it onto the chat so that you can have all the detail that has been shared here as well. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you hopefully soon. If you're part of the WEAll family, we have our very big event happening on the 15th of November. I've shared it in the chat too. It is our policy design guide reflection session. So the 4 hubs that actually tested and piloted the policy design guide, which was created with over 70 of our members, have gone through this process, and they're going to be sharing their reflections, their learnings on the 15th of November. So look out for that in the chat as well, but I have shared it already. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks so much, folks.
There is the chat.
Yeah,